London, September 2nd, 1666. 1 in the morning. A baker named Thomas Farriner wakes to find his bakehouse on Pudding Lane filled with smoke. The ovens, which should have been properly extinguished before bed, are still hot. Something has caught. He doesn't know exactly what, and in the darkness and the thickening smoke there isn't really time to find out. He wakes his family. His daughter. His servants. They make their way upstairs, and one by one they climb out through an upstairs window, lowering themselves onto a neighboring roof and scrambling to safety. Their maid, whose name history has not recorded, is too frightened to follow. She stays behind. She will be one of the first people to die in what we now call the Great Fire of London. Outside, the wind is strong and dry after a long summer drought. The houses on Pudding Lane are timber-framed and packed together so tightly that their upper floors nearly touch. The streets below are narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass. And the fire, finding plenty to eat and a good breeze to carry it, does what fire does when you give it everything it needs. It begins to move. Turn off the lights. Pull the blanket up. And tonight we're going to 17th century London, to a city of timber and thatch, of narrow cobbled streets and open sewers, of churches and counting houses and a river that ran silver through the middle of it all. A city that burned to the ground in 4 days and then, slowly, painfully, and with extraordinary ambition, built itself back better. This is the story of the Great Fire of London. One of the most dramatic events in English history. A catastrophe that killed almost nobody and destroyed almost everything. And one of the strangest accidental improvements a city has ever made to itself. How does a fire in one bakery destroy most of a major city in 4 days? And why did nobody stop it sooner when they had the tools and the tradition to do exactly that? What was London like before the fire? What was it actually like as a place to live and breathe and walk through that made it so desperately, so completely vulnerable? And how does a catastrophe that destroys 13,000 homes and leaves 100,000 people sleeping in fields end up being, in many ways, the best thing that ever happened to a city? London, 1666. A city of roughly 500,000 people, the largest in England, one of the largest in Europe, a place of extraordinary energy and extraordinary squalor existing side by side in a space that had never been properly planned and had never particularly wanted to be. The medieval city of London, the old walled square mile at the heart of it, was a dense, organic, almost incomprehensible tangle of streets, alleys, courts, and lanes that had grown up over centuries without anything you could call a plan. Timber-framed houses were built so close together that the upper floors almost touched across the narrow streets below. Thatch roofs were common in the poorer areas. Open gutters ran through the streets. There was almost no open space between buildings, no parks, no squares, no fire breaks of any meaningful kind. Just buildings, pressed up against other buildings, all the way down to the river. The summer of 1666 had been exceptionally dry. Months without significant rain had left the timber structures of the city desiccated, dried out in a way that made them not just flammable but almost eager to burn, like kindling stacked and waiting for a spark. The city had no professional fire service. It had leather buckets. It had hand-pumped water engines. It had a tradition of pulling down houses to create fire breaks, which was effective and which everyone knew was effective, but which required the Lord Mayor's permission. And on the night of September 2nd, 1666, the Lord Mayor was not a man who gave permission easily. Chapter 1. London before the fire. To understand why the Great Fire of London was so devastating, you have to understand what London actually looked like in 1666. And the honest answer is that it looked like a city that had been daring fate for a very long time. The medieval city of London had grown up over more than 1,000 years with essentially no planning, no building codes, and no concept of fire safety as a civic responsibility. It had grown the way cities grew before anyone thought it was a government's job to tell people how to build their houses, organically, opportunistically, one building at a time, each one fitted into whatever gap was available, each one built to maximize the floor space of the plot it sat on. And the way you maximized floor space in a medieval city was by building upward and outward simultaneously. Each floor of a timber-framed building would overhang the street a little more than the one below it, jutting out on wooden brackets called jetties, so that by the time you reached the third or fourth floor, the building extended several feet beyond its own ground floor footprint. The result, multiplied across thousands of buildings on both sides of narrow streets, was a city where daylight barely reached the ground in many places. Where neighbors on opposite sides of an alley could lean out of their upper windows and pass things to each other, and sometimes, in the narrowest courts, almost shake hands. It was intimate in a way that modern cities simply aren't. It was also, from any practical fire safety standpoint, a catastrophe waiting for its moment. Wood was cheap in 17th century England, and stone was expensive. That is really, at its most basic, why London was built the way it was. Stone buildings existed, the great churches, the livery halls, the wealthier merchants' houses, but the vast majority of London's housing stock was timber-framed, with panels of wattle and daub or brick filling the spaces between the wooden structural members. These buildings were old. Some of them were very old indeed, patched and repaired and added to over generations until the original structure was buried under layers of subsequent work, each layer drier and more combustible than the one before. The roofs of the poorest areas were still thatched, bundles of dried straw or reed that would catch a spark and hold it the way a bird's nest holds warmth. London in 1666 was also a city of industries that worked with fire and with flammable materials as a matter of daily routine. Bakers, like Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane, kept their ovens burning through the night. Chandlers made candles from tallow. Brewers kept their copper vats boiling. Wharfingers stored oil, pitch, tallow, coal, and timber in the riverside warehouses that lined the north bank of the Thames from London Bridge westward. The city smelled of smoke on a perfectly ordinary day. Small fires were so common that most Londoners had the experience of helping to fight one, forming bucket chains, pumping the hand-operated fire engines that parish churches kept in reserve, pulling down a burning roof with iron fire hooks before the flames could spread to the next building. And that last technique, pulling down buildings to create fire breaks, was crucial. It was well understood. It worked. A sufficiently wide gap between burning buildings and unburned ones would stop a fire cold, because fire travels by contact and by throwing sparks, and a gap wide enough and clear enough could interrupt that process. The problem was that pulling down buildings meant destroying them, and in 1666 there was no mechanism for compensating the owners. It meant deciding unilaterally in the middle of the night that someone's home or someone's business had to be sacrificed. It was a power that required authority and nerve and a willingness to make enemies, none of which the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, had in any great abundance. But all of that comes in a moment. For now, let's just sit for a moment in the London of September 1st, 1666, the evening before the fire begins. It is a Sunday evening. The streets are quieter than they'd be on a weekday, the shops shuttered, the taverns beginning to empty as curfew approaches. The summer has been long and hot and very dry. People have noticed the dryness, the way timber seems to crack in the heat, the way the river is lower than usual, the way dust rises from unpaved courts and alleys at the slightest movement. But they haven't fled. They have no particular reason to. Fires happen. Fires get put out. Nobody living in London in the summer of 1666 has lived through anything that would give them cause to imagine that a fire could be anything other than a local event. A bakehouse, a warehouse, a stretch of 3 or 4 houses at most, and then the bucket chains and the fire hooks and the hand pumps would do their work, and life would go on. The city of 500,000 people goes to bed. Thomas Farriner banks his ovens, or thinks he does. The east wind blows steadily in from the estuary, warm and dry, carrying the smell of the sea. And somewhere in the bakehouse on Pudding Lane, in the dark, something is still glowing. The great fire of London is about to begin. If you're enjoying this, and the fire hasn't even really started yet, which should tell you something about how this story is going to go, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. New sleep history stories every Thursday and Sunday right here on the Still Hour. And drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from tonight. I genuinely read every single one, and I love knowing where in the world this channel reaches. Back to London. It's just after midnight on September 2nd, 1666. Thomas Farriner's bakery is on fire, and the wind is picking up. Chapter 2. The fire begins. The fire in Farriner's bakehouse on Pudding Lane started sometime around 1 o'clock in the morning on September 2nd, 1666. In its first hour, it was a local fire, serious, certainly, but not unprecedented. Neighbors were woken by the smoke and the heat. Bucket chains formed in the street. People shouted and ran, and tried to do what Londoners had always done when a building caught fire in the night. The house next door to the bakery caught. Then the one next to that. By the time anyone thought to fetch the Lord Mayor, the fire had consumed most of Pudding Lane and was working its way toward the waterfront. But fires consumed a few houses in London on a reasonably regular basis. The system, creaking and improvised as it was, usually worked. So someone, a parish official, possibly a constable, went to wake Sir Thomas Bloodworth, Lord Mayor of London, who arrived at the scene somewhere in the small hours of the morning, looked at what was in front of him, and delivered himself of one of the most spectacularly misjudged assessments in the long history of people being wrong about things. "A woman might piss it out," he said, and then he went back to bed. It would be easy, and genuinely tempting, to treat Sir Thomas Bloodworth as a simple fool, a buffoon, a man so catastrophically wrong about something so obviously serious that history is justified in laughing at him down the centuries. And the temptation is understandable, because he was wrong. Catastrophically, city-destroyingly, historically wrong. But it's worth pausing for a moment to consider what he was looking at, and why he reached the conclusion he did, because it makes the failure marginally more comprehensible, if not remotely more forgivable. Bloodworth was the Lord Mayor in a year when London had already had a very hard time. The Great Plague had killed tens of thousands in 1665. England was at war with the Dutch. The city was tired, and its institutions were strained. Bloodworth himself was not, by any account, a particularly capable or decisive man. He had been elected to the mayoralty largely on the strength of his wealth and his connections, not his administrative talent. But what he saw, arriving at Pudding Lane in the middle of the night, was what looked like a serious but manageable house fire that had spread to a few neighboring properties. He had no frame of reference for what it was actually becoming. Nobody in London did. They had no concept, no lived experience, no ancestral memory of a fire that couldn't be stopped. So he looked at it, made a decision based on the evidence available to him, and went home to sleep. The evidence available to him did not include the wind speed, the dryness of the timber, the particular combination of factors that, by the time the sun rose over London on the morning of September 2nd, had turned a bakehouse fire into something that stretched across hundreds of yards of waterfront and was moving, steadily and hungrily, toward the west. By sunrise, the fire had reached the riverside warehouses. And this is where the Pudding Lane fire became the Great Fire of London, because those warehouses were full. They were packed with the materials of a great trading city: oil, tallow, pitch, coal, hemp, timber, spirits. Materials that didn't just burn but erupted. Materials that threw burning fragments into the air on the east wind and carried sparks across distances that a bucket chain could never bridge. The fire ate through those warehouses with a speed and ferocity that stunned the people watching from the river, and as it ate, it grew, and as it grew, the heat it generated began to create its own weather, the intense convection of a large fire drawing air inward and upward, creating wind where there might otherwise have been calm, feeding itself on the oxygen it was pulling in from across the city. By the time Bloodworth returned that morning, because he did return, to his credit, even if too late to make the decisions that mattered, the fire had spread to dozens of houses and was moving fast. He now faced the decision he had declined to make in the night, whether to order houses pulled down ahead of the fire to create fire breaks. And he hesitated. He worried about the cost. He worried about who would compensate the owners. He gave partial orders that were carried out too slowly and too narrowly. Every hour of hesitation was an hour in which the fire moved further west, consuming more of the city, making the fire breaks harder to create and less likely to work. It is one of the defining lessons of the Great Fire of London, that the tool for stopping an urban fire was available and understood, and that it failed not because of any technical limitation but because of a failure of nerve at exactly the moment when nerve was most needed. Chapter 3: 4 Days of Fire. The Great Fire of London burned for 4 days. 4 days in which the city was transformed. first into an inferno, then into a ruin, and in which the people of London experienced something that none of them had imagined possible and that all of them would carry with them for the rest of their lives. On the first day, Sunday, September 2nd, the fire moved west and north from Pudding Lane, driven by a strong, dry east wind that showed no sign of dropping. It consumed Fish Street Hill. It consumed the wooden buildings clustered around London Bridge. It moved along the north bank of the Thames, taking the wharves and the warehouses one by one, each one burning spectacularly, throwing burning fragments onto unburned buildings further along the river, setting new fires ahead of itself before the main body of flame had even arrived. The air above the Thames was full of sparks. People on the south bank of the river stood and watched. People on boats in the river watched. Some of them rowed away. Some of them stayed, transfixed by something so enormous and so terrible that it produced, alongside the horror, a kind of terrible beauty that witnesses would struggle to describe for years afterward. On the second day, Monday the 3rd, the fire reached its full devastating momentum. It had now consumed enough of the city to have established itself as something genuinely beyond normal control. The fire breaks were being created, but they were always a little too small, or a little too late, or in the wrong place, because nobody had ever had to coordinate a firefighting effort on this scale before, and there was no system in place to do it. The fire jumped gaps that should have stopped it. It moved through the dense networks of courts and alleys in the older parts of the city with frightening speed. It reached the merchant districts to the west of Pudding Lane, the counting houses, the goldsmiths' shops, the livery halls of the great trade guilds. It consumed them all with the same indifference it had shown to the humbler buildings closer to the river. Samuel Pepys, naval administrator, diarist, and one of the sharpest observers of 17th-century London, watched the second day of the fire from the river and from the rooftops and from wherever else he could find a vantage point, and what he recorded in his diary is one of the most vivid primary sources we have for the entire event. He describes the fire as a most horrid, malicious, bloody flame. He describes the people in the streets below, carrying their possessions out of their houses in carts and on their backs, stacking furniture in the streets, and then having to abandon it and run when the fire arrived faster than anyone expected. He describes the boats on the Thames so overloaded with salvaged goods that they rode dangerously low in the water. He describes pigeons, the pigeons of London, which had lived on the window ledges and in the eaves of the burning buildings, hovering over the rooftops, reluctant to leave, until their wings caught and they fell. And in between watching his city burn, Samuel Pepys went home and buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese in his garden. This detail has delighted readers of his diary ever since, and it says something wonderful and very human about Pepys that even in the middle of one of the greatest urban disasters in English history, he was not going to lose his Parmesan without a fight. On the third day, Tuesday the 4th, the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral. The old St. Paul's, the medieval cathedral that stood at the highest point of the city of London, the largest church in England, a building that had stood for centuries and that Londoners had always assumed would stand for centuries more. The cathedral had been used as a book warehouse in the years before the fire. Booksellers had stored their stock in the crypt, believing, reasonably enough, that the massive stone walls would protect it. They were wrong. The heat of the fire outside was so intense that it penetrated the stone, and when it did, thousands of books caught simultaneously, turning the cathedral interior into a furnace of such ferocity that the lead on the roof melted and ran down the walls in rivers. John Evelyn, another diarist, another extraordinary witness, described the lead flowing down the streets in a stream, and the very pavements glowing with a fiery redness, so that neither horse nor man was able to tread on them. He described the stones of the churches calcined by the heat, reduced to powder, crumbling at a touch. He described the air full of fragments of burned paper from the bookseller's stock, drifting for miles on the wind, some of them still legible when they landed in fields beyond the city walls. The fall of St. Paul's was the moment, if the Great Fire of London can be said to have had a single defining moment, when the full scale of what was happening became impossible to deny. This was not a fire. It was an erasure. On the fourth day, Wednesday the 5th, the wind dropped. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. The fire breaks that had been laboriously created over the previous days began to do their work. The fire, deprived of its great driving force, began to slow. It continued to burn. It would smolder in cellars and ruins for weeks, but its great advance was over. By Thursday the 6th, the worst was finished. The Great Fire of London was out. In 4 days, it had consumed roughly 400 acres of the city, 13,000 houses, 87 churches, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, Guildhall, 44 livery halls, and St. Paul's Cathedral, the heart of the city, the building that had defined London's skyline for generations. Chapter 4. Samuel Pepys and the Eyewitnesses. History is full of events that we know happened but can barely feel. We know the dates, we know the scale, we know the statistics. But the statistics of the Great Fire of London, the acres burned, the buildings destroyed, the churches lost, can only take you so far toward understanding what it was actually like to be there. For that, you need the people who were there. And in 1666, London had 2 of the finest diarists in the English language. Samuel Pepys was 33 years old when the Great Fire broke out. He was a naval administrator, a clerk of the Acts for the Navy Board, which sounds dry and bureaucratic but was actually a position of considerable importance and influence. He was ambitious, energetic, curious about everything, and in possession of a gift for writing that he seems to have been entirely unaware of. He kept his diary in a shorthand code, partly for speed, partly for privacy, and what he recorded across nearly a decade is one of the most extraordinary windows into 17th century life that we have. He wrote about his work and his ambitions and his marriage and his many indiscretions and his music and his food and his books, and in early September 1666, he wrote about the fire. Pepys first heard about the fire at 3 in the morning on September 2nd. His maid woke him to tell him there was a fire, and he looked out of his window, judged it to be far enough away not to be a concern, and went back to sleep. This is a very Pepysian response. By 7 o'clock he was up again and found the fire considerably closer. He dressed and went out, and then spent the next 4 days in a state of barely contained fascination and terror, watching his city burn from boats and rooftops and hillsides, noting everything, talking to everyone, recording it all in his diary with the meticulous eye of a man who understood, even in the middle of the crisis, that he was watching something that would be talked about forever. What makes Pepys so invaluable as a witness to the Great Fire of London is not just that he was observant, but that he was honest about the full complexity of his own response. He was frightened. He was moved. He was, at moments, clearly awestruck in a way that he found almost guilty. There is a passage in his diary where he describes watching the fire from the river at night and calling it one entire arch of fire from this to the other side of the bridge, and in a bow up the hill for an arch of above a mile long. It made me weep to see it. He wept. He wept at the destruction of his city. And then he went home and buried his cheese and his wine, because he was also a practical man who was not going to let sentiment get in the way of protecting his Parmesan. He also recorded the human chaos around the fire in a way that no official document could. The people loading their possessions onto carts and pushing them through the streets, unsure where to go. The people carrying goods down to the Thames and loading them onto boats, and the boatmen, entrepreneurs even in catastrophe, charging extortionate rates for the service. The streets so full of people and carts and horses that movement became almost impossible, so that people were trapped by their own salvage operations while the fire gained on them. He recorded the animals, the cats left behind in burning houses, the horses mad with terror, the pigeons he describes hovering over the rooftops until they couldn't anymore. He recorded the sound of the fire, the roaring and the crashing of falling buildings, and underneath it all the strange and terrible sound of the burning city creating its own wind. John Evelyn, who walked through the ruins in the days after the fire died, adds a different dimension to the picture, not the fire itself but its aftermath. Evelyn was an intellectual, a man of science and letters, a founding member of the Royal Society, and he brought to his description of the ruins the eye of someone who was simultaneously heartbroken and compelled to understand. He walked through the devastated city and noted the ground still hot underfoot days after the fire had passed. He noted the way the stones of the churches had been transformed by the heat, limestone calcined to powder, brass and lead reduced to puddles that had cooled and hardened in the gutters. He noted the smell, ash and char, and the strange, sweet smell of burned wood, and underneath it something darker, something he couldn't quite identify. He noted the silence. After the roar of the fire and the noise of the city in crisis, the ruins of the City of London were extraordinarily quiet. No birds, no voices, no movement except the drift of ash in the September air. Together, Pepys and Evelyn give us something that the official records of the Great Fire of London cannot. They give us the sense of what it felt like. And what it felt like, to be there, to watch it, to walk through the ruins, was something between nightmare and revelation. A nightmare because of what was lost. A revelation because of what was suddenly visible. The bones of the city, stripped of everything that had covered them, lying open to the sky for the first time in centuries. Chapter 5. The Death Toll and Its Mystery. Here is one of the strangest facts about the Great Fire of London, a fact that has puzzled and unsettled historians ever since the fire was first seriously studied. The official death toll is 6. 6 people, confirmed dead, in a fire that burned 400 acres of a city of 500,000 people. 6 recorded deaths, in a disaster that destroyed 13,000 homes and left 100,000 people without shelter. The number seems not just low but almost impossible. A statistical absurdity, a clerical error, a rounding down so extreme as to be meaningless. And the answer to the puzzle, when you begin to pull it apart, says something important not just about the Great Fire of London but about the nature of history itself, about who gets counted and who doesn't, about what records survive and what they record, and about the long shadow that poverty casts even over the act of dying. The official figure of 6 deaths comes from the official records of the fire, the formal accounts compiled in the days and weeks afterward by parish officials, coroners, and government clerks. And those official records documented what official records in 1666 always documented: deaths that were reported, that could be verified, that happened to people whose deaths someone with authority took notice of. Farriner's maid, who stayed behind in the bakehouse. A few others similarly documented. 6 people total. But the Great Fire burned most extensively through the oldest and most densely populated parts of the City of London. The areas closest to Pudding Lane, the streets and courts and alleys around the waterfront, the cramped warrens of housing in the eastern city where the poorest Londoners lived in the greatest density. These were areas where people were already invisible to official record-keeping. They were lodgers and casual laborers and elderly people living alone and anyone else who existed at the margins of a society that didn't look very hard at its margins. When these people died, in house fires, in accidents, of illness, they were often not formally recorded at all. And in the chaos of the Great Fire of London, as the official apparatus of the city collapsed along with its buildings, the gap between what happened and what was recorded grew enormously wider. The fire also moved quickly enough that most people did have time to escape. That much is probably true. It wasn't a fire that overtook people in their beds. It was a fire that moved through streets in a way that gave most people hours, sometimes days, to get out ahead of it. The catastrophe was one of property, overwhelmingly. People lost their homes, their businesses, their belongings. They did not, in most cases, lose their lives, at least not immediately. But not immediately matters here, because the 100,000 people who were driven from their homes by the Great Fire of London didn't simply disappear. They went somewhere. Many of them walked out of the city gates and camped in the open fields of Moorfields and Islington and Southwark, in the meadows and commons that surrounded the medieval city walls. They camped there in September as the nights grew colder and the days shorter. They camped there with whatever they had managed to carry. Some with carts full of salvaged goods, others with almost nothing. They had no shelter except improvised tents and the charity of people who had the space to take them in. Many of them were old or sick or very young. And in that situation, exposed, displaced, with no home to return to, some of them would have died of exposure and illness in the weeks and months that followed. Those deaths were almost certainly never counted as deaths caused by the Great Fire of London, because they happened too late and in too scattered a way and to too invisible a population for any official record to connect them to the fire. Some historians have estimated the true death toll of the Great Fire of London may have been in the hundreds. We will never know for certain. The fire erased not just buildings but records, The parish registers of the destroyed churches, the records of the livery halls, the accounts of the businesses and households that burned. Some of the documentation of who lived and died in the city of London in the summer of 1666 burned in the fire that killed them. History ate its own evidence. What we know with certainty is this: by the end of September 1666, the medieval city of London was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone, reduced to a flat, smoking plain of ash and rubble that stretched from the river to the city wall, interrupted here and there by the stubborn remnants of a church tower or a livery hall that had been built of stone solid enough to survive what the timber buildings couldn't. The ground was still warm underfoot. The air still smelled of ash. And somewhere in that ruin, in the silence that had replaced the roar of 4 days of fire, 100,000 displaced Londoners were beginning to wonder what came next. The fire was over. But the story of what the fire started, the rebuilding, the arguments, the ambition, the extraordinary transformation of a medieval city into something that would define London's character for centuries, that story was only beginning. The Great Fire of London, 1666, Part 2. And then the fire went out. And London looked at itself. And what it saw was roughly 400 acres of ash, rubble, and the calcined stone of 87 churches. The streets that had existed for centuries, the narrow, winding, medieval streets that had accumulated like sediment, layer on layer, generation on generation, were gone. The timber frames that had held up 10,000 houses were gone. The markets and the warehouses and the guild halls and the taverns and the shops selling candles and spices and ribbons and rope were gone. The Royal Exchange was gone. Newgate Prison was gone. The old St. Paul's Cathedral, which had stood for centuries and been battered by lightning and used as a stable during the Civil War, was gone, its lead roof melted and running in silver rivers down Ludgate Hill. And somewhere in the middle of all that destruction was a question: what do you build when you have the chance to start over? It's one of the oldest questions in human experience, and one of the most loaded, because starting over is never clean. It never arrives as a gift. It always arrives as a catastrophe first. And the people standing in the ash of London in September of 1666 were not thinking about opportunity. They were thinking about where to sleep. They were thinking about winter, which was coming. They were thinking about who, exactly, had done this to them. That question, who did this, turns out to be just as interesting as the question of what to build next. Maybe more so, because it tells you something essential about how human beings respond to loss. About how we need our suffering to mean something. About how the search for an explanation, even a wrong one, is sometimes more powerful than the acceptance of a messy, unspectacular truth. Let's start there. Chapter 6. The Conspiracy Theories. The smoke was still rising. In the days and weeks after the Great Fire, as Londoners wandered through the ruins trying to understand what had happened to their city, a particular kind of grief was taking hold. And that grief, as it almost always does, was beginning to curdle into something else. Something harder and more focused and more dangerous. It was beginning to curdle into blame. Because here is the thing about a catastrophe without an obvious cause. The human mind cannot rest in uncertainty. We are not built for it. When something terrible happens, when your city burns, when everything you own turns to ash, when 100,000 people are suddenly homeless, there has to be a reason. There has to be a someone. The alternative, that something this enormous and this devastating could simply have happened because a bakery caught fire in a hot, dry summer, is almost psychologically unbearable. It makes the world feel ungoverned, random, indifferent. And indifference, somehow, is worse than malice. At least malice you can fight. So London looked around for enemies. And in 1666, there was no shortage of candidates. England was at war with both France and the Dutch Republic. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had been grinding on since 1665, and it was not going well. The relationship between Protestant England and Catholic Europe was, to put it diplomatically, tense. The memory of the gunpowder plot, the Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament in 1605, was still alive in the English imagination. Anti-Catholic sentiment was not a fringe position in Restoration London. It was essentially the cultural weather. So when people started asking who might have wanted to burn the city down, The answer came easily and quickly: the Catholics, or the French, or the Dutch, or some combination of all three, working together in a great popish conspiracy to destroy Protestant England. These theories spread fast. People claimed to have seen men with fireballs, with flaming brands, with incendiary devices, deliberately throwing fire into houses. There were reports, many of them from many parts of the city, of foreigners behaving suspiciously. In at least one case, a French painter named Paul Lowell was attacked by a mob who believed he had been seen starting fires. He had not. He was nearly killed anyway. In the heightened, terrified atmosphere of a city watching itself burn, the distance between suspicion and certainty was almost nothing at all. And then came Robert Hubert. Robert Hubert was a French watchmaker. He was, by almost all accounts, a troubled man. Contemporaries who observed him described behavior consistent with what we would now recognize as serious mental illness. He was confused. He was suggestible. He was, in the particular way of people whose grip on reality is uncertain, prone to constructing narratives about himself that may have felt real to him even when they bore no relationship to the truth. Robert Hubert confessed to starting the Great Fire of London. He said he had done it deliberately, as part of a conspiracy. He said he had thrown a fireball through the window of the bakery on Pudding Lane. He said, eventually, under questioning, that he had been put up to it by a gang of fellow conspirators. He provided details that seemed, to his interrogators, like the kind of details only a guilty man would know. The problem was that almost none of it held up. The bakery on Pudding Lane did not have a window of the kind he described. More devastatingly, there was evidence, strong evidence, later reviewed and found credible, that Robert Hubert had not even arrived in London until 2 days after the fire had started. He had been aboard a ship. He had witnesses. The timeline of his own confession, when examined carefully, was incoherent. None of it mattered. Robert Hubert was tried, convicted, and hanged at Tyburn in October 1666. Even the judge at his trial appears to have had doubts. The surveyor Richard Wiseman said afterwards that he could not believe Hubert was guilty. The captain of the ship on which Hubert had arrived in England confirmed that he had been at sea when the fire began. And yet the machinery of justice, operating in a city that desperately needed someone to blame, ground forward. And Robert Hubert went to the gallows for something he almost certainly did not do. It is one of the clearest examples in English history of what happens when a justice system stops asking what is true and starts asking what people need to be true. The Great Fire of London needed a villain. Robert Hubert, confused and alone and unable to mount a coherent defense, became that villain. The city needed to believe the fire was an act of malice rather than an accident, because malice is something you can punish. You cannot punish a baker who left his oven smoldering. You cannot punish a hot summer and an east wind. The conspiracy theories didn't end with Hubert's execution. The monument to the Great Fire, built decades later by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, and still standing today near the northern end of London Bridge, originally bore a lengthy inscription on its base attributing the fire to a Catholic plot. Here by permission of heaven, it read in its Latin original, "Hell broke loose upon this Protestant city." The inscription was famous enough that the poet Alexander Pope wrote about it. It was taken seriously enough that it remained on the monument for more than a century and a half. It was only removed in 1830, nearly 200 years after the fire, when Catholic emancipation finally made the official story embarrassing enough to change. In a world without forensic science, without fire investigation as a discipline, without any systematic way of determining the origin and cause of a fire, with genuine political enemies who genuinely might have wanted to harm England, with the fresh trauma of watching your city burn and your home disappear and your neighbors scatter to the fields, in that world, the search for a human explanation was not paranoia. It was not stupidity. It was a completely understandable response to an event that felt too large and too terrible to be anybody's fault in particular. That understanding doesn't change what happened to Robert Hubert. He was innocent. He was hanged. And London got to feel, for a moment, that justice had been done. Sometimes history gives you a clean villain. And sometimes the villain is the story itself, the one that a grieving city needed to tell. Chapter 7. Christopher Wren and the rebuild. While London was looking for someone to blame, one man was looking at something else. He was looking at the ash. And he was seeing something in it that most people couldn't see yet. He was seeing a city. Christopher Wren was 33 years old in 1666. By any measure, he was already remarkable. He was a mathematician of serious standing. He'd been a professor of astronomy at Oxford, a subject he'd more or less mastered before deciding it wasn't quite enough of a challenge. He was a scientist, a fellow of the early Royal Society, a man whose range of intellectual interests made even his brilliant contemporaries slightly tired just thinking about it. He was also increasingly an architect, though increasingly is doing some work there, because Wren's architectural career was still in its relatively early stages when the fire changed everything. What the Great Fire gave Christopher Wren was something almost no architect in the history of the world has ever been handed: an entire major city to redesign from scratch. Within days of the fire dying out, Wren had drawn up a plan. It was breathtaking in its ambition and, looking at it now, genuinely beautiful in its logic. Wren wanted to tear up the medieval street plan of London entirely. Gone would be the winding, organic lanes that had simply grown over centuries without any guiding intelligence, accumulating like the rings of a tree. In their place, a rational city. Wide, straight streets radiating outward from key points. Open piazzas, public squares, airy and light, of the kind that Wren had seen on the continent and that London had never really managed to achieve. A grand riverside quay along the Thames. The whole thing laid out with the clarity and confidence of a man who had spent years thinking about geometry and space and proportion, and who had just been handed the most extraordinary brief in architectural history. He was not the only one who submitted a plan. John Evelyn, the diarist, submitted one within days as well. Robert Hooke, Wren's friend and collaborator, had ideas of his own. The king's advisors had thoughts. Everyone, suddenly, had thoughts about how London ought to be rebuilt. None of the grand plans were implemented. This is one of the great might-have-beens of English history, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because the reasons the plans failed are entirely human and entirely understandable. The city of London in 1666 was not an empty canvas that could simply be redrawn. It was a city of competing property rights, competing legal claims, competing financial interests. Every inch of the burned ground belonged to someone. Every lane and alley that had existed before the fire had a legal identity, a history of ownership and tenancy and inheritance and debt. Rebuilding along entirely new street lines would have meant resolving thousands of individual property disputes before a single brick could be laid. And in the meantime, 100,000 homeless people needed somewhere to live. The urgency of reconstruction was simply too great to permit the luxury of a wholesale redesign. London could not wait for its street plan to be litigated. People needed roofs. So Wren's grand plan, the piazzas and the radiating boulevards and the rational geometry, stayed on paper. And Christopher Wren, who might have been the man who gave London the street plan of Paris, became instead the man who gave London something arguably more intimate and more lasting. He was commissioned to rebuild 51 of the churches destroyed in the fire. 51 churches. Each one different. Each one a separate problem in space and light and structure and acoustics. Each one an opportunity to do something that had never quite been done before. Wren designed them over decades, and if you know what you're looking for and you walk through the city of London today, you can still find them: the white stone steeples, the varied and inventive spires, the interiors that somehow manage to feel both formal and intimate at the same time. St. Bride's on Fleet Street, with its tiered wedding cake steeple that allegedly inspired the shape of the modern wedding cake. St. Mary le Bow, whose bells defined the boundary of the true London. A Cockney being, traditionally, someone born within the sound of Bow bells. St. Stephen Walbrook, which Wren apparently regarded as a personal favorite, a small church with a dome of such delicate beauty that it served as a kind of rehearsal for what was coming next. What was coming next was St. Paul's Cathedral. The new St. Paul's took 35 years to build. 35 years. Wren was 37 when the foundation stone was laid in 1675. He was 72 when the last stone was set in place in 1710. He lived long enough, He died in 1723 at the age of 91, to see it finished and to see it become, almost immediately, the defining landmark of the London skyline. The Great Dome, visible from almost everywhere in the city, became what St. Paul's has been ever since, the emblem of London's persistence. Its refusal to stay broken. Wren's legacy in the rebuilt London is almost impossible to overstate. He did not get to redesign the street plan. He did not get his piazzas or his grand boulevards. What he got instead was the churches and the cathedral, and in them he put everything. Every idea about light and space and proportion and beauty and the way that architecture can make you feel, just by walking into a room, that something larger than yourself is present. That the world has structure and intention and grace. He turned a catastrophe into a cathedral. Not many people get to do that. And almost nobody does it as well. Chapter 8. The New London. So what did the rebuilt London actually look like? And how different was it from what had been there before? The answer is, considerably different. Not in every way, and not exactly according to any grand plan. But different in ways that mattered enormously to the people who lived there, and that matter still, in ways that ripple forward to us today. The most immediate and practical change came from the Rebuilding Act of 1666, which Parliament passed with impressive speed in the months after the fire. The act was, in its way, a piece of genuine political courage, because it imposed restrictions on property owners that many of them fiercely resisted, and it did so in the name of a principle that had been made devastatingly obvious by 4 days of watching the city burn. Timber was finished. No new buildings in the City of London were to be built with timber frames. All construction had to be in brick or stone. The Act specified in considerable detail the required thickness of walls, the minimum widths of streets, the maximum heights of buildings on different types of street. It distinguished between 4 categories of house, from modest lanes to high streets to principal streets to the most important thoroughfares, and set different specifications for each. It was, in essence, the first comprehensive building code in English history. And it transformed the city. The new London that rose on the rubble of the old one was a city of brick. Red brick and brown brick and the creamy Portland stone that Wren used so beautifully in his churches and his cathedral. It was a city with slightly wider streets, not the grand boulevards that Wren had envisioned, but streets wider than the medieval lanes that had made the fire so impossible to fight, streets where a cart could actually pass another cart without one of them mounting the pavement. It was a city where the buildings were lower and more regular and more orderly than before, and where the upper floors no longer overhung the streets below, blocking out the light and dropping their rubbish and their waste into the narrow channels beneath. It was, in other words, a city that had made itself harder to burn. And that was not a small thing. But the physical changes, significant as they were perhaps less interesting than the economic and social changes that accompanied them. The fire had done something to the property landscape of London that no peacetime government could ever have deliberately chosen to do. It had wiped the slate clean. The accumulated property arrangements of centuries, the leases and the subleases and the customary rights and the guild territories and the ancient tenancies that had kept certain streets locked into certain uses for generations, were gone. And in the space that remained, something new could grow. The rebuilt London was a more commercially dynamic city than the one that had burned. New kinds of businesses moved into areas that had previously been dominated by older trades. The coffee houses, those remarkable institutions of Restoration London, where men gathered to read newspapers and argue about politics and conduct business and exchange information, proliferated in the rebuilt city. The financial district that would eventually become one of the most powerful in the world began to take shape, its geography partly determined by the practical decisions of the rebuilt. Even the demographics of certain neighborhoods shifted, as people who had fled to the western suburbs during the fire sometimes decided to stay there, accelerating the westward expansion of fashionable London that would define the 18th century. None of this was planned. None of it was anyone's intention. It was the consequence of an empty canvas, of a moment when the accumulated compromises of centuries had been swept away and people had to make fresh decisions, unconstrained by the weight of what had been there before. The medieval city had been a maze. Not charming in the way that word now sounds, not the picturesque tangle of a tourist's imagination, but genuinely difficult to navigate, genuinely unsanitary, genuinely dangerous in its density and its combustibility. The new London was not perfect. It was built fast, under pressure, by people trying to solve immediate problems. But it was built to standards that the old city had never had. And it was built in materials that gave it a durability the old city had never possessed. When you walk through the city of London today, through those streets that run, more or less, along the same lines as the post-fire rebuild, you are walking through a city that was, in a very real sense, made by the worst thing that ever happened to it. Chapter 9. What the fire changed permanently. Beyond the buildings. Beyond the street plan and the new churches and the rising dome of St. Paul's. Beyond the brick and the Portland stone and the regulated street widths. The Great Fire of London changed things that you can't see. Changed the way the city thought about itself and about risk and about the future. Changed institutions and habits and practices that have lasted, in various forms, down to this present moment. The most direct of these changes was insurance. Before the Great Fire, fire insurance did not exist in England. It didn't need to, or rather, people had managed without it, in the way that people manage without things until a catastrophe makes the need undeniable. The destruction of 1666, which wiped out the life savings of thousands of property owners in 4 days, made the financial risk of fires so viscerally and catastrophically clear that the market for something new was suddenly, desperately obvious. In 1681, 15 years after the fire, the first fire insurance company in English history was established. It was called the Fire Office. It was followed quickly by others, the Hand in Hand, the Sun Fire Office, the Union, and a dozen more as the idea took hold and competition developed. These companies wrote policies on individual properties and accepted the financial risk of fire damage in exchange for regular premiums. The concept was new. The need was not. But here is the part that often surprises people. The insurance companies didn't just write policies. They also created fire brigades. Because an insurance company that accepts the risk of fire damage has a very strong incentive to make sure fires are extinguished before they can spread. So the early fire insurance companies organized their own brigades of men with pumps and buckets and, eventually, engines. They employed fire marks, small metal plaques, often depicting the company's emblem, which were fixed to the front of insured buildings so that a brigade arriving at a burning street would know which buildings were their responsibility to save. The mental image this produces, brigades of competing insurance company firefighters arriving at a burning building, checking the fire mark, and potentially moving on if the building belonged to a rival company, is both slightly comic and genuinely historically significant. Because those private brigades, operating for profit, were the direct ancestors of the modern professional fire service. The discipline, the equipment, the organization, the sense that firefighting was a professional activity requiring training and structure rather than simply a matter of neighbors with buckets, all of that developed, in England, out of the commercial logic of fire insurance, which developed directly out of the lesson of the Great Fire of London. The building regulations established by the Rebuilding Act of 1666 were equally consequential. The principle that a government could and should set minimum standards for the construction of private buildings, specifying materials, dimensions, structural requirements, was not entirely new, but the Great Fire gave it a force and a legitimacy it had never quite had before. Those standards, refined and expanded over the following centuries, are the foundation of the building codes that govern construction today. Every time a modern building is required to have fire-resistant materials, or minimum corridor widths, or specific means of escape, the logic of those requirements traces back, in a direct historical line, to the lessons of 4 days in September 1666. And then there is the monument. It stands today just north of London Bridge, a tall column of Portland stone that most people pass without knowing quite what it commemorates or why it is exactly the height it is. The height is the clue. The monument is 202 feet tall. And it stands exactly 202 feet from the site of Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane, where the fire began. If you laid it flat, in other words, it would point directly at the place where everything started. Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke designed it that way, with the mathematical precision that both men brought to everything they made. It was completed in 1677. It has stood for nearly 350 years. It has been climbed by Samuel Johnson and by countless tourists and by the poet Alexander Pope, who climbed it and then mocked its inscription attributing the fire to Catholic conspiracy. It is still there. Right now, if you were standing in that part of London, you could walk to it in minutes and look up at the gilded urn of fire at its top, which has been catching the light in the same way for 3.5 centuries. Some things survive their catastrophes. Some things are made by them. Chapter 10. The Fire That Made London. Here is a strange and slightly uncomfortable thing to say about the Great Fire of London. In almost every measurable way, the city that rose from its ashes was better than the city that burned. Better built, better planned, better regulated, better protected against future fire, better ventilated and less densely packed and less catastrophically, immediately vulnerable to the next disaster waiting to happen. And the disaster before the fire had been waiting, very specifically, for a long time. Because the Great Fire did not arrive in an ordinary year. It arrived in 1666, the year after London had lost perhaps 100,000 people to bubonic plague. Think about that for a moment. Plague in 1665. Fire in 1666. Two of the most devastating catastrophes in the city's history, back to back, within 13 months of each other. London lost roughly a fifth of its population to plague and then watched what remained of its physical infrastructure consumed by fire. And it was not destroyed. It rebuilt. And in rebuilding, it cleared away the conditions that had made both disasters as bad as they were. The medieval city, the dense, airless, timber and plaster city that burned in 1666, had been the perfect environment for plague as well as fire. Its crowding, its open sewers running down the middles of narrow streets, its lack of ventilation, its thousands of rats and fleas living in the same cramped spaces as its human inhabitants, all of that had made the plague of 1665 as lethal as it was. The fire destroyed that city. The brick and stone city that replaced it was cleaner, more open, more resistant to the conditions that had turned plague into catastrophe. The Great Fire of London, in a very real sense, helped end the era of plague in London, not intentionally, not as anyone's plan, but as a consequence of replacing a medieval death trap with something considerably safer. This is the strange philosophical territory that the Great Fire leads you into, if you follow it far enough. It is one of history's clearest examples of catastrophe creating opportunity, and opportunity seized by remarkable people working under enormous pressure, producing something better than what was there before. Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke. The Parliament that passed the Rebuilding Act with such unusual speed and ambition. The builders and the bricklayers and the craftsmen who constructed 51 churches and a great cathedral in the decades after the fire. The insurance men who looked at the ruins and saw not just loss but a gap in the market. All of them, in their different ways, took the worst thing that had happened to their city and built something from it. That is not a comfortable story, and it shouldn't be made too comfortable. The fire killed people. It ruined people. The 100,000 who slept in the fields outside London in September 1666, with winter coming and everything they owned destroyed, they were not looking at an opportunity. They were looking at the end of their world. The maid who died in Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane in the first minutes of the fire did not have a role in any story of urban improvement. She was simply gone. History is full of this kind of doubling. The terrible thing and the good thing that came from it are both real. The suffering is real and the progress is real, and they cannot be separated from each other, because the progress came specifically from the suffering and would not have come any other way. The fire that destroyed London was not a good thing. But what London did after the fire, that was something extraordinary. And maybe that is the most honest and the most human thing to say about it. Not that it was good. Not that it was meant to be, but that people, given the worst possible start, sometimes build something remarkable. Given the ash and the rubble and the calcined stone and the question of what comes next, sometimes what comes next is a cathedral. Come back to Pudding Lane one more time. It is very early in the morning. The 2nd of September, 1666. The city around you is dark and quiet in the way that cities are quiet at 2 in the morning, not silent, but subdued, the noise of the day pressed down into something low and still. The summer has been long and dry and hot, and the timbers of the buildings around you have been drying out for months, slow and patient, like kindling waiting for its moment. In the bakery, Thomas Farriner and his household have gone to bed. The ovens have been banked for the night, or they should have been. Something, somewhere in the heat and the wood and the tinder-dry conditions of this particular building on this particular night, is not quite right. A coal. An ember. Something small and patient and very warm. The kind of small mistake that has been made 10,000 times before in 10,000 bakeries and has never, until now, mattered quite this much. The fire starts slowly the way fires do. It finds the nearest thing that will burn, and then the nearest thing after that. Climbs. It spreads to the hay in the yard next door, and to the buildings on either side. Somewhere in the house, a maid is woken by the smoke and cannot get out. The rest of the household escapes across the rooftops. The fire is now free, and the east wind is awake, and the city of medieval London, 1,000 years of accumulated human building, a tangle of lanes and timber frames and overhanging upper floors and warehouses full of rope and tallow and oil, is beginning its last hours. For days later, it is done. Now let the years pass. Let them move faster than they should. Let them tumble forward in the way that time does when you're almost asleep, when the edges of things soften and the sequence doesn't quite matter. A few years. A decade. A little more. Come back to the same street. The lane is wider now. Not much, not the grand boulevard that anyone might have dreamed of, but wider, with room for carts to pass each other, with light actually reaching the ground. The buildings on either side are brick, red and solid and improbable seeming against the memory of what was here before. The overhanging upper floors are gone. The narrow channel of sky above the street is wider than it used to be. And if you look up, above the rooftops, above the new brick chimneys and the slightly more rational geometry of the new city, you can see steeples. White stone steeples, one after another, marking the sites of the 51 new churches that are going up all across the old burned ground. Each one different. Each one carrying something of the hand and the mind of the man designing them, a man who was 33 when the fire started and who will be building for decades yet. And rising above all of them, not yet finished but visibly, unmistakably becoming itself, the dome. Not the final dome yet. The scaffolding is still up. The Portland stone is still being cut and lifted and set in place. But the shape is there, the idea of it, the great curve against the London sky that will one day be the most recognizable skyline in the world. The fire consumed medieval London. And what came after? The brick city, the regulated city, the insured city, the city of Wren's churches and Wren's cathedral and the monument standing 202 feet tall and pointing, if you laid it down, at the spot where everything started. What came after was a city that would go on to be, for the next 2 centuries, the most important city in the world. The city of fire became the city that could not be burned. Now rest. London is still there. It always rebuilds. And maybe that is worth taking with you into sleep tonight. The thought that the things we build after the worst moments are sometimes the best things we ever make. That the ash and the rubble and the empty space where something used to be is not just an ending. That human beings, given a chance to start again, carry something forward from the fire. Something they didn't know they had until they needed it. Close your eyes. The ovens are cooling. The city is quiet. And somewhere, out of the ruin, something is beginning to rise.